In previous chapters, we've dealt with what we do when we're trying to conserve wild populations. In this chapter, we're going to talk about what happens when those wild populations go extinct and we have to try to conserve the species in the absence of natural habitats. In many situations, species might be extinct in the wild in certain habitats, but still present elsewhere, either in zoos or in other undisturbed habitats. In these situations, if the original habitat somehow becomes rehabilitated, then we can do what is known as reintroduction. We can take individuals from extant populations or from captivity and reintroduce them to the wild. Alternatively, our existing populations might drop below their minimum viable population size, and in this case we would reintroduce individuals in the process of reinforcement. We would just try to buffer that existing population to bring it up above the MVP. But oftentimes the factors that cause the population to go extinct in the wild in the first place, like human development, are still present. And in that case, we have to find other places to try to reintroduce them. If we're taking individuals and bringing them to a new location where that species has never been found before, we call that introduction. Regardless of the type of introduction, oftentimes these new populations need some degree of protection at the very beginning of their introduction, especially if they consist of young, vulnerable individuals, and we call this a soft release. In the event of a soft release, we also introduce food and shelter to protect them during these vulnerable times. One form of a soft release is what we call a head start, and that's where we take juvenile individuals, raise them in a sheltered environment until they're mature, and then release them into the habitat where they can sustain themselves. All of these previous terms apply to animals. If we were talking about plants, then usually what we're talking about for a soft release is adjusting the microsite, that is, adjusting the moisture, shade, and nutrients of the locality where we're introducing the plants to make sure that they survive their vulnerable stages. But some species are just really robust, like bison, and we can do what's known as a hard release. We just reintroduce them to a suitable habitat and let them go. If we've reached the point of reintroduction, then we're likely dealing with an endangered species that's protected under the ESA, or the Endangered Species Act. If all of our hopes of saving a particular species are in one introduction event, we call this an experimental essential population, and it receives the full protection of the ESA. If the population is stable elsewhere or in captivity, and we're just trying to introduce them to see how they do, then we call this experimental non-essential, and it's not protected by ESA. In the event that it's an experimental essential introduction, then it receives full protection under the ESA, which means that any development that occurs in or around this population has to occur with mitigation. Mitigation means that that development has to occur with minimum disruption to the current habitat, or suitable habitat has to be created elsewhere. Everything we've talked about so far is what we call in situ conservation. That is, we're trying to save species that are endangered, but we're still doing it in the wild. If the in situ attempts have failed, then sometimes our only hope can be what we call ex situ conservation, and that's conservation of species that occurs in zoos, aquariums, or botanical gardens. Ex situ conservation means that our only hope of saving a species is preserving it in captivity. Ex situ conservation is incredibly risky and incredibly expensive. Most of the time, species in this situation require assistance in reproduction, that is through things like cross-fostering and help with fertility like embryo transfers. Botanical gardens have an advantage of being able to create seed banks. They can create reservoirs of genetic material stored in seeds that will last decades to hundreds of years. They also have an additional responsibility of preserving both wild species and land races. Land races are agriculturally important crops that have co-evolved with indigenous human populations for thousands of years. And because ex situ conservation is very expensive and very risky, it oftentimes fails, meaning that a species has gone extinct. In that event, our only hope is a process called de-extinction. That is, taking genetic material from extinct species and trying to reintroduce that into living species in hopes of reanimating the extinct species. De-extinction is by far the most expensive conservation option, and at this point, it is highly unfeasible and unsuccessful. And that takes us back to the precautionary principle. If there's a risk involved with a particular species, just don't risk it to begin with, and you won't have to worry about paying for all of the expenses of trying to conserve it.